right, viewers. So on the show today, we have our very first live edition, live interview of the Black Agenda podcast. And our guest today is Mr. Miles Rapoport, who is a senior practice fellow in American democracy at the Ash Center for Harvard Kennedy School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Miles has been very active with politics, trying to work to better our democracy in different ways. He's a longtime organizer, policy advocate, former elected official. He was even recently president of the independent grassroots organization called Common Cause. And he previously served as Connecticut Secretary of State and was a state legislature for 10 years. So Miles is very versed, really an expert on the subject of what we're talking about today, which is voting. The enfranchisement here in the United States of America. And so, Miles, we appreciate you joining us for our very first live show. And thank you for talking with us.
Thank you. Thank both of you, Devin and Adrian. I'm glad to be here.
Right. So our very first question, of course, we have to ask you, November 3rd is less than a week or almost a week away now. And we have a very distinct choice, between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So, off the top, if you could just kind of, give us your thoughts as somebody who's been involved in politics, been a state legislature, been a Secretary of State. What are your thoughts on the current political climate and the current election? And what do you think we'll see come November 3rd or 4th when we get a result?
All right. Well, just a couple of things. I was the Democratic Secretary of the state of Connecticut, so it won't surprise you that I'm a strong supporter of Joe Biden for president. But I've been mainly focused on, how is the election going to go? Are we going to be able to have, in the middle of COVID-19, in the middle of all of the polarization, in the middle of the resurgence of white nationalism, are we going to be able to have the kind of election that really, the American people deserve? I would say on that level, I'm sort of encouraged right now. I am worried about some things. There certainly has been some voter suppression in a number of states around the country. Not all, not even a lot, but in some. There's certainly been the proclamations of President Trump that that the whole thing is rigged and he may not honor it. That's very troubling as a kind of an observer of democracy. But overall, I think that the fact that as of today, 65.1 million people have voted is a really extraordinary thing. And I think we're going to see a very, very high turnout, and that's good for our democracy.
I think you're absolutely right. We have to have more participation in our democracy. I think at the end of the day, that if we're going to live in a country that likes to go around the planet telling people about democracy and about capitalism and how people should have a right to voice their concerns, then we should be championing voting rights. I think, Miles, one of the things that we're looking at with 2020, I think it's going to be a record turnout year. I think that, everyone's always talking about this is one of the most important elections of our lifetime. And I believe maybe we are finally right in saying that. But even though we seem to be predicting high voter turnout, it seems like America still lags comparatively to other developed countries as far as who participates. So one question, I guess, Miles, in your opinion and doing all your research, why do you believe that it's time for America to finally do something like mandatory voting? And do you think it would have any benefits to help offset our low turnout?
Yes, on both counts. I think that the United States has for a very long time been almost at the bottom of industrialized countries. I think we're like 26th out of 31 of the OECD countries in terms of turnout. We get a good turnout, generally speaking, for a presidential year is like 60%. And during a midterm election, it can be down as low as 40%. In 2018, we had an uptick in voting. We had about a little over 50%. And I think this year we could have up over 65, even 70%, which would be a record for the United States. But Adrian, to your point, that's still not very, very good. If you go back to the Declaration of Independence and you say we want to be a country based on the consent of the governed, We want to be a country on the consent of all the governed, not just some of the governed, not just some of the people who vote. And as we well know, voting has always been skewed by income. Higher income people vote in more by race. White voters have come out more strongly overall, although I think African American voters have really caught up on that. And young voters are always lower turnout. So that drove me, as someone who's spent 35 years working on these issues, to say, okay, if all the things that we've done, and we've done a lot, same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration, restoration of voting rights for people with felony convictions, have only got us to the point where we're, 60, maybe we'll get to 65% this time, then what could we do that would really, really move the needle? And at that point, I started studying what they've done in other countries around the globe, and particularly Australia has had voting to be a requirement of every citizen, and they've had it since 1924, and they get 90% turnout in every election. And there are a lot of other good benefits of it as well. So I decided to kind of put my efforts on this, about 2 years ago. We just issued a report on it, and I'm hoping that we'll put it into the debate.
So Miles, of course, we saw that you and Janae did your research and to look around the world and see what other countries were doing when it comes to, making voting mandatory. And we were looking on the list as well, and we were trying to find countries that were somewhat similar to the U.S. as far as population wise. A lot of them are smaller, the ones that do mandate voting, but Brazil comes pretty close at about 210 million people. But after looking at these different models of the different countries around the world, Miles, what do you think is the best model for us here in the United States to try to present and to try to implement to make voting mandatory?
Right. Well, I think the first thing we have to do is just conceptualize or think about voting differently. And we already do this with jury service, right? You are required as a citizen of the United States to go and serve on a jury if you are called. There's a modest penalty if you don't, and everybody thinks that's part of being a citizen. And the reason we do that is because you want juries to be reflective of the population as a whole. That very concept of being judged by a jury of your peers. Well, I think the exact same thing applies to voting. We want the decision made by the American people as to who's going to be president or who's going to be senator or who's going to be governor or who's going to be your local state representative to be made by all of the people in the jurisdiction. And we think with a very mild, very small penalty of a kind of like a $20 parking ticket, but we would inculcate in everyone the idea that voting is a civic duty. It's a right. It's an absolute civil right, but it's also a duty. And I think what we would get if we had 90% turnout or 85% turnout would be a tremendously different electorate that looked much more like the whole people of the United States.
One follow-up, Miles, I guess, because what you said was when you look at jury duty, we want our juries to be made up and kind of reflect our communities and look like everyday people and things. I mean, do you think that maybe a part of maybe, I don't know if it's the politicians or us as Americans, maybe do you think that we don't want our government and our leaders to be reflective of our country as a large? Maybe we just want them to look like who we look like. Maybe that's an issue that we have in our country.
Well, that sort of depends who you think we is, but we, in my mind, ought to be everyone. Look, there's been a long-standing struggle in this country over expanding the right to vote. Go back over the history, and originally it was only white men of property. Then, after the Civil War, African Americans theoretically got the right to vote. 1920, women got the right to vote. Only in the 60s, through the civil rights movement, did African Americans, break through the Jim Crow barriers. And only in the 1970s did 18-year-olds get the right to vote. So all in all, all along there has been an effort to expand the vote, and there have been efforts, just as you said, to restrict it, to say we don't really, really want everyone to vote. And I think that that has been a mantra or a slogan of powerful people who want to keep the relationships of power and the relationships of the economy the way they are. But I think for those of us who believe that we want an economy where everyone has an equal chance and a democracy where everyone has an equal say, the idea of making it easier for people to vote in all kinds of different ways, and then B, having the expectation that everyone will vote, would be a good idea. And by the way, what the term we use for this is universal civic duty voting. The idea that we want everyone to vote, it is a civic duty. And the universality is what we want to focus on, not the mandatoriness of it.
Yeah, and that's fair because people hear mandates, they hear mask mandate, voting mandates, and people, a lot of folks just don't like, they see it as an intrusion of big government telling you what to do. But I think hearing you explain it, hearing you talk about it, and present it in a way of a universal, civic duty. To me, it comes to you in a different way and saying this is your duty as an American, as someone who lives in the country. It is your responsibility to go out and vote and elect officials and make your voice heard. And so, because that's what makes us different than the rest of the world. So I think, you had some really good points. And like you say, you did your research. Of course, there were folks there was some pushback to this idea of mandatory or universal civic duty voting that we're going to get into after break. So we're going to take our first break. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the counter arguments, as you say, some things that people think we could do in lieu of making voting mandatory. So we'll get into those after the break. Stick with us. We'll be right back.
Yesterday, we were on our way, but November came, man, I wish it was yesterday. Yesterday, we were on our way, but November came, man, I wish it was yesterday.
All right, viewers, let's get back into this where we're going to be looking at some of the counter arguments to the idea of universal civic duty voting. So one of the things we saw, Miles, was a letter to the editor with some responses to the op-ed that you and Janae wrote, where it seemed like one writer seemed to suggest that if you aren't as educated, maybe you shouldn't vote. Like, he mentioned the fact that there's some people who can't name the three branches of government, people who can't even name, rights within the First Amendment. So I guess, Miles, first question is, it's easy, but is voting a privilege for the qualified, or do you feel that it's a right for everyone? And how do you think we can get that message over to everybody as far as everyone being able to have a voice, and it shouldn't be only entitled to qualified people?
Yeah, I certainly think that voting is a fundamental right for everyone. And that once you start making restrictions on it based on, people's knowledge, I mean, that goes back to the old literacy tests in the Jim Crow South. And I think it's a slippery slope to go on. But I would say we encountered two kind of arguments from the conservative side. One was what Devin said a little while ago, and that was that any kind of compulsion or anything that you're required to do, is a bad idea. And what we're recommending is that it be a very, very light fine, maybe a $20 fine that does not get multiplied by interest or penalties, and can be done, by community service rather than the fine itself. And secondly, that if you really, in a conscientious way, don't want to vote, that would be an acceptable reason for not voting. And what they do in Australia is if you haven't voted, they send you a letter and they say, hey, why didn't you vote? And you can write back with almost any reasonable explanation. I was visiting my grandmother in Perth, or, but you can also say, I chose not to vote because I have a religious or conscientious objection. That would be okay with us. So I don't think it's really a compulsion in that way at all. I think it's constitutional, and I think it works. The second argument, Adrian, is what you just said, which is, that goes by the nickname of the ignorant voter argument. And I think that's a dangerous and fundamentally undemocratic argument, that somehow some people are smarter and more educated. Maybe they're wealthier, maybe they're whiter, than the population as a whole, and we should restrict the franchise only to them. I think it's a bad idea. I think overall, we will get much better decisions, much more representative decisions from government if every single person is in the society is represented and participates in the process.
And kind of picking off what you were talking about, Miles, there, because Devin and I, we keep hinting around the idea that we're going to do an episode on, civic education, civic duty. I mean, whenever you have someone that makes the allegation, which is actually probably true, that people can't name the three branches of government or don't know what the Bill of Rights are. What do you think that says deeper about our country, or about what we should really be focusing on versus the whole forcing people to vote?
One of the things that I actually think would be a positive from the idea of stipulating a civic requirement of voting by every citizen is that I think all of the institutions of the society would adapt themselves to that. So if every 18-year-old had to vote, and if you were a principal of a high school, would you have stronger civic education to make sure that people were prepared for it? I think you would. If you were a corporation and you knew all of your employees had to vote, were required to vote, would that make you more likely to give people time off to vote, which some corporations are doing now, but not all? Yeah, I think it would. So I think what you would have is if we set this out as a goal of universal participation, I think we'll work our way toward it through civic education, through nonprofit organizations encouraging people to get registered and to go out and vote, as we are doing now. But I think they have even a stronger motivation. So, the one argument I really resist is the idea that people are apathetic and they just don't care. I think people have lots of reasons for not voting. Some people don't think the system works for them. Some people think all politicians are alike. Some people just don't know how to vote, or they're concerned about whether they're going to, screw it up when they go to the polls, because it can be complicated. I think all of those things require a tremendous amount of public education, but I think we can get there, and that ought to be our goal, which is to create a culture in which everybody knows they have to vote, they want to vote, and they want to participate. And to be honest, I think that 2020 has a lot of that appearance. You see people standing online for 6 and 7 and 8 hours. It's because they want to make sure that they are heard in this moment, in this fraught moment of our history. And I think that's a good thing.
Most definitely. I think you have definitely seen a surge in enthusiasm, and people are just not going to be, regardless of how many times the rules change, as far as, where you can vote, how you can vote. People are not, they're undeterred. They're going to be at the polls, like you say, waiting for hours to cast their ballot. So that's definitely a good sign. And so, of course, we talked about, making it mandatory and how there's going to be some resistance to that. I guess my question here is kind of similar to that, but, should we implement, universal civic duty voting? What agency, how would this play out, I guess, in the country? Because we have a different voting system where really the voting system is done on the state level. So how would, federal government implement this policy to get all the states to come on board, do you think?
Well, it's interesting. We looked at doing this on the federal level, the possibility of it being done on the federal level, but also being done at the state and even at the municipal level. And the truth is, I think what's much more likely to happen over the next some odd years is that some states will decide to give this a try. A state like, let's take Colorado, for example, which has a very, very, they're always first or second in voting. They have a very welcoming system of voting. But they might say, we'd like to make sure that everyone is voting, and they might undertake this. And if it works, and if people turn out, and if people like the culture adapts to it, as I'm hoping that it will, then it'll start to get adopted in other states. So I think this will be state by state. Municipalities can do it. but they would require state approval to do it in most cases. And you could imagine it at the federal government. Look, we have the Voting Rights Act, we have the National Voter Registration Act. There are instances where the federal government has passed laws that set standards of how elections for federal offices will be run at the state level. And we could do that in this case. I think it is I don't expect it. Look, our goal in the Universal Voting Working Group was just to get the idea out into public discussion. And from that point of view, I really appreciate the fact that you two are having me on to talk about it, because it's the kind of discussion, it's exactly the way I hope this issue will get out into the public domain.
No, you're absolutely right, Miles. I think the whole reason why Devin and I wanted to start this podcast was a way to kind of start to protest, but also do it in a more of an educational way, because we've got to start paying attention to these issues and start realizing that until we all stand up and voice our concerns, we won't get to that change that we keep talking about every 4 years. Right. One of the things that we noticed was that there's, I think, about 19 states currently that do some sort of form of automatic voter registration. There's many states that are trying to expand mail-in ballots or already do mail-in ballots. But this year, we've seen such huge efforts of voter suppression, voter intimidation, and a lot of false claims of mass voter fraud. We've heard the rhetoric from the president talking about illegals, dogs, and dead people voting. We've seen efforts from the Republican Party to do illegal drop boxes, court cases to stop voting counts, and even maybe dropping the drop box count down to one drop box per county, like in Texas. So, Miles, how do we overcome all of this voter suppression that we're seeing? And do you think that universal civic duty will help to fight, voter suppression and some of these false claims that we have that seem to kind of inflame the current political situation we have this year?
Yeah. Well, voter suppression has been historically a significant problem. And for a long time, it was kind of held in check by the Voting Rights Act, and the fact that under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, states that had problems and had been suppressing the vote before had to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department before they could make a change. In 2013, in the Shelby versus Holder decision at the U.S. Supreme Court, the Voting Rights Act was gutted. And immediately after that, a number of states, mostly Republican, many in the South, but not all, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, have rushed to implement voter identification, and they use the argument of fraud. Every single study that has been done says that the idea of voter fraud by voters voting in other people's names or trying to, vote 2 or 3 times, it just doesn't happen. I mean, it happens, but an infinitesimal amount. And it's been really disappointing that the president of the United States has been, promoting this idea, which has been discredited by every serious observer of it, including the Heritage Foundation, which has kept a long time list of voter fraud and is very small. So anyway, I think that the way to overcome it. But I would say, on the other hand, there has been a really robust and growing democracy movement. I wrote the op-ed in the LA Times with Janae Nelson from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and they have been stalwarts in the fight to, kind of keep the system open. So in the courts, in legislatures, through protest, a lot of the voter suppression has been pushed back. And as you were saying before, I think this year, people are just saying, I am not going to be deterred. I am going to cast my vote. I'm going to make a plan. I'm going to do it early. Thankfully, some of the states opened up their mailing process and opened up early voting in recognition of COVID. So I think I'm an optimist on this. I do think that there will be people who try to suppress the vote. You have seen it in a lot of places, but I think the overwhelming story of this election is going to be that people refuse to be deterred, and we're going to have the highest turnout we've ever had in this country.
No, I think that's right. That's right on, and we're seeing it, in play right now during early voting season. People are ready. People are fired up. They're enthused. There's a ton of enthusiasm, and they're going to be undeterred. So, Yeah, this is great to talk about. So we have one more break, and when we come back, we'll get your final thoughts, of course, as far as universal civic duty voting and the election. So stick with us. And again, we're speaking to Miles Rapoport. Rappaport, sorry if I messed that up. He is from the Harvard Kennedy School, the Ash Center for Democracy in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So we'll be continue our conversation right after the break. Stick with us.
All right, viewers. So we're getting into our final message here with Miles. And, Miles, we've been talking so much about 2020 and how chaotic it's been. I feel like we're living during a time that's just probably been unheard of for most Americans. I mean, we're going through a pandemic where it seems like the simplest solutions are to just wear a mask, do some social distancing, and wash your hands. And medical experts are saying that if we do those things, we can save a lot of lives. But we've lost over 220,000 lives, and people can look at that. And yet, still, people aren't really, playing to the facts of the experts. No one's wanting to wear a mask, and people are making it so partisan. So whenever we go to the fact that we can look at something as simple as wearing a mask and how that can save lives, and we look at the issue that we've talked about today, which is Americans not wanting to be told what to do with this whole idea of universal civic duty. I guess, Miles, what is your final message to get us there? When people don't even want to wear a mask to save lives, how are we going to get to a point where people feel that they should go and vote to make change in our community? So what's that final message to the politicians to why we should entertain universal civic duty? And what would you say to voters this year who decide or who maybe want to stay at home and not vote this upcoming November?
Well, I guess I'd say two things in terms of voters and this year's election. I think it's an incredibly important election. It's almost a cliche by now, but I do think this is probably the most important election of our lifetime, and my lifetime is a lot longer than yours, so I can say that. There is a real sense of polarization, and there is a resistance to change. America is being reborn. The population is changing. We're becoming a much more varied country. Young people are coming into their own. Some of the old hierarchies and patriarchies are going by the boards, and you're getting resistance to that. And I think Donald Trump sort of represents that, and he stokes it, and he, he's trying to sort of be the border wall, so to speak, against the future. So what I think people have to do this year is to just, get rid of that noise, go out and vote. I'm delighted to see how many people are voting already. I think it's going to be a very, very large turnout. And obviously, I hope that when the outcome will be that that Joe Biden, who I think is a president who really will try hard to represent everybody, will do that. Once that happens, as we look to the future, I think there are lots of agenda items that the country is going to have to look at. The kind of racial wealth gap that people have been talking about, the kinds of inequalities that we see, the climate change and the threats to the planet going forward. But one of the issues that I think really is important is how do we get our democracy right? And I think what's going to happen is that people at the state level, at the municipal level, and even at the federal level are going to have to say, what are the laws that we can change? What are the practices that we can promote that are going to get us to genuinely full, inclusive, democratic participation? And I think when we have that discussion, the idea that I'd like to put on the table, and Janae Nelson, who was my co-author of the LA Times piece, would like to put on the table, is the idea that voting becomes a civic duty and a responsibility and a requirement for every citizen and every eligible citizen in the United States. I think that's the kind of conversation we need to have. And I'm appreciate the opportunity to be with you and have that conversation. And I hope we'll be able to have it again in the future.
Definitely. I think it's something we all should be thinking about, something after 2020, the things that we need to get done. We have work to do when it comes to our election system and the way we vote. I mean, heck, even the day that we vote on, like, why is it not on the weekend? Or why is it not a federal holiday to give everybody the opportunity to go out and vote? So, people may be resistant to change, but I think it's hard to look at the current system and say that there aren't improvements that we can be making. And universal civic duty voting is something down the line that maybe we could implement to make sure that enfranchisement is giving to everybody within the country to make it easier, for folks to make their voices heard. So Miles, this has been a really fascinating conversation to talk about something. It's hard to imagine now, and in the lens that we're looking through in 2020, seeing the polarization and the work that's being done to suppress the votes of certain people. But I do think, looking to the other side, this is definitely something I think we should entertain. We should make it a civic duty. Everybody should participate, no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, especially the folks that are lower on the totem pole. Their voices need to be heard. So voting is the way that you do that. So if you don't get anything outside of this conversation, do know that your voice counts, and they wouldn't try so hard to suppress it if it didn't matter. So it definitely matters. So again, so just to kind of wrap it up here, we're talking with Miles Rapoport. He's in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's from the Harvard Kennedy School, particularly the Ash Center for Democracy. Political veteran, activist, been active all over, and we had an interesting conversation about should voting be mandatory. If you want to read it, I think if you just Google Miles Rapoport mandatory voting, it's an op-ed that he and Janae Nelson from the Legal Defense Fund wrote for the LA Times. And so we got a hold of it. We had to have him on and have the conversation. So Adrian, you got any last thoughts before we go?
Please, I was just going to say, please keep writing, because this was this topic was just so interesting. I think it was definitely one that we needed right now, because I don't care who you are. Voting shouldn't be a partisan issue. It shouldn't be if you're a Democrat or a Republican, we want you to vote or we don't want you to vote. And I think, Miles, what you and Janae are doing really just speaks to the greater issue of what Devin and I are trying to do, which is to address the education deficit that we have in America. Because I think that what y'all are talking about would really help with that, because all the arguments about people not knowing about branches of government or not knowing about the candidates, well, if you had a civic duty behind voting, well, like you said, Miles, you would have organizations that would go out and educate people over the candidates. And if you're in California, we got so many propositions that you'd be confused over, but you can have organizations that would make sure people know what's going on. So I'm just thrilled and appreciative of what y'all are doing, because, I mean, since Congressman John Lewis passed away, voting has been something that we've tried to kind of adopt as a theme for the Black agenda. And anybody who's trying to endorse it and make it to where people can be heard, we just really, really are thankful.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. I was really, really glad to be with you.
No problem, Miles. Until next time.
Okay. It's a deal.